Winds of departure. Lena hurried through the bustling train station in San Francisco, eyes scanning the crowds for a familiar face. The station was alive with the usual flurry of activity: businessmen in suits and ties, women in their elegant dresses, children darting through the legs of adults, captivated by a vendor selling brightly colored balloons. The sea of faces seemed endless, a maze she couldn't find her way through. She straightened her navy blue dress and clutched her handbag, her hands trembling. She glanced at the telephone booths across the hall but dismissed the thought of using one. They were all occupied, and even if they weren't, she wasn't sure who she could call. Her mind raced as she walked aimlessly, the echoing hum of people and the hiss of the trains surrounding her. War posters adorned the walls, bold letters urging young men to enlist and defend America. She paused briefly before the image of Uncle Sam pointing straight at her, as if asking for more than she could give. Suddenly, she spotted a group of soldiers at the far end of the hall, their uniforms stark against the muted colors of the station. Her heart leapt, and she darted through the crowd, weaving between families and strangers. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice barely carrying above the noise. "Excuse me," she tried again, louder this time. The soldiers turned, but none of the faces were familiar. Her shoulders slumped with disappointment. "I'm sorry," she stammered. "I thought you might know where I can find the platform for the 4:15 to New York?" A young black soldier shrugged, giving her a sympathetic smile. "Ma'am, we just got here ourselves. But the info desk's over there." "Thank you," she managed, hurrying towards the desk. Her heart pounded as she saw the large clock above, 4:10. She joined the short line, barely able to keep still until it was her turn. The woman behind the counter gave her a quick, dismissive glance. "How can I help you, miss?" "Please, the 4:15 to New York. Has it left yet?" "It's still here," the attendant replied flatly. "Platform 7 down the hall to the right." "Thank you," Lena said, rushing off in the direction she'd been given. Her heels clicked against the tiled floor as she navigated through the signs pointing to platforms 6 to 10. Her breath caught when she finally spotted the sign for platform 7 and stepped out into the cold air. She clutched her hat against the wind as steam billowed from the waiting train. Soldiers in olive green uniforms boarded steadily, saying hasty goodbyes to their loved ones. Lena's eyes darted among the faces, nearly ready to give up when she felt a hand on her shoulder. "Ellie," she gasped, turning to face her girlfriend. Ellie's dark brown hair was neatly tucked under her uniform cap, and her brown eyes softened when they met Lena's. Ellie looked taller, more sure of herself, as if the uniform had added years to her stature. "What are you doing here?" Ellie asked, her voice gentle but surprised. She had always been the composed one, even now in the chaos of the station. "I came to see you off," Lena replied, her voice wavering. "I heard from your parents that you were leaving, and you didn't even tell me yourself." "Why, Ellie? Why didn't you write to me?" Ellie sighed, her grip tightening on Lena's hand. "I'm sorry, Lena. I didn't want to worry you. It's been hard enough knowing what's ahead, and I couldn't bear the thought of making you wait without knowing if I'd come back." "But I'm already waiting, already worried," Lena said, her voice cracking. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back, willing herself to stay strong. Ellie held Lena's gaze for a moment, her expression softening. "I should have told you. I never meant to hurt you like this." Lena looked at her closely, taking in every detail, the sharpness in her eyes, the set of her jaw. "You've changed," Lena whispered. Ellie managed a small bittersweet smile. "You too. Look at you, all grown up, working in that hospital. Making a difference." "I'm training to be a nurse," Lena said, offering a tentative smile. "Maybe I can help some of the soldiers like you." Ellie nodded, her expression turning serious again. Can you forgive me, Lena? I need to know you'll be all right while I'm gone. How could I not? Lena replied, her voice barely audible. She reached out to embrace Ellie, wrapping her arms around her, as if she could hold her there forever. Ellie pressed her cheek to Lena's hair, speaking softly into the crook of her neck. When I get back, we'll pick up where we left off. Go for a walk by the bay like we used to. Get ice cream at that place on the corner, the one with your favorite mint chocolate chip. We'll watch movies at the Rialto, just you and me. That sounds wonderful, Lena whispered, a lump forming in her throat. And then, maybe we can get that little place by the coast, the one we always talked about, with a garden and a swing just like you wanted. Ellie's voice cracked as she painted the dream they'd shared so many times. Lena managed a watery smile, nodding. Yes, that would be perfect. All aboard. The conductor's voice cut through the air, and Ellie flinched, glancing at the train. It's time, she said, her voice unsteady. Ellie, promise me you'll be careful. I promise, Lena, she said, a tremor in her voice. I'll come back to you. Wait, Lena said, fumbling with the clasp of the locket she wore around her neck. She pressed it into Ellie's hand. Keep this with you. A piece of home. Ellie took the locket, slipping it into her pocket and holding Lena's gaze for a long moment. She leaned down and pressed a kiss to Lena's forehead, lingering as if to memorize the moment. Then, with a final reluctant squeeze of her hand, she turned to board the train. Lena watched her disappear into the carriage, her eyes burning with unshed tears. She glanced around the platform, seeing other families saying tearful goodbyes. An elderly mother pressing a scarf into her son's hands, a young father lifting his daughter into the air one last time. It was a parade of hope and heartbreak, stretching along the length of the train. As the train began to move, Lena took a deep breath, clutching the cool iron railing at the edge of the platform. She knew Ellie had kept something from her, something about where she was really headed. Lena could see the fear hidden behind Ellie's smile, could feel it in the way her hands shook during their final embrace. She realized that Ellie might not come back, but she couldn't bring herself to speak that fear aloud. The train chugged out of the station, and Lena stood alone among the scattered crowd, watching as it carried away the one person she loved most. The rhythmic clatter of wheels drowned out the hushed goodbyes, and the platform blurred through her tears. Deep down, she clung to a thread of hope, even as the truth settled heavily in her chest. She would wait no matter how long it took. Lena stood on the platform long after the train had disappeared from sight, the echoes of farewells and the hum of the departing engine still lingering in the cool, foggy air. She clutched her hands together, willing herself to be strong, but the warmth of Ellie's last embrace was already slipping away, leaving her feeling hollow and alone amidst the sea of strangers. The crowd on the platform began to thin out, families wiping away tears as they drifted towards the exits, their footsteps slow and heavy. Some held on to each other for support, while others walked alone, their eyes vacant as they clutched letters or mementos left behind by the loved ones they'd just sent off. Lena watched them, feeling a sense of kinship with these strangers, bound together by a shared quiet grief. She turned back to where the train had been, taking in the sight of the empty tracks, the rails gleaming under the dim station lights. A lump rose in her throat as she realized that Ellie was really gone, on her way to war, to some place Lena couldn't follow. She brushed a hand across her cheek, wiping away a tear before it could fall. "I'll see you again, Ellie," she whispered to the emptiness. "I have to believe that." As the platform continued to empty, Lena forced herself to move, her steps heavy as she made her way towards the station exit. She could still hear the voices of the station workers and the occasional chatter of a lingering passenger. But the world outside felt unbearably quiet, as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for the next letter, the next piece of news from across the ocean. Stepping out into the foggy San Francisco streets, Lena shivered as the wind cut through her coat. She turned up the collar, clutching it close, but the chill seeped deeper than just her skin. It settled in her chest, tightening her throat with the ache of loss. She knew she needed to keep moving, to find something to fill the long hours that stretched ahead of her. But all she could think of was Ellie. Ellie laughing on a sunlit hill. Ellie holding her hand as they walked along the pier. Ellie's voice whispering promises in the dark. She made her way down the cobblestone street, passing a small church where a few families had gathered for evening prayers. She paused at the doorway considering going inside, but the idea of speaking to anyone, even God, felt too raw, too overwhelming. Instead, she continued on, her steps carrying her to the hospital where she had been training to be a nurse. Inside, the warmth of the building wrapped around her like a blanket, and the familiar scent of antiseptic filled her nose. Nurses and doctors moved through the hallways, their faces lined with exhaustion. Lena slipped into the break room, where a few of the other nurses sat hunched over cups of coffee, talking in hushed tones about the latest wounded soldiers brought in from overseas. They glanced up when she entered, offering her small, understanding nods. Everyone knew the weight of what it meant to say goodbye in these times. Lena forced a smile and made herself a cup of coffee, cradling the warmth in her hands. She couldn't stop herself from wondering where Ellie was now, whether she was already far from the station, or if she was leaning out a window, looking back at the receding skyline of the city. Was she thinking of Lena, clutching the locket in her pocket the way she had when they'd first said goodbye? She settled into a chair in the corner, trying to lose herself in the familiar rhythms of the hospital, the distant sounds of footsteps and murmured conversations. But her thoughts kept drifting back to Ellie's words, to the dream of the little house by the coast. It felt fragile now, like a dream that might shatter with the next letter or telegram, but she clung to it, needing something to hold on to in the darkness. Days turned into weeks, and Lena found herself falling into a routine that felt both comforting and empty. She woke up before dawn, dressed in her nurse's uniform, and spent long hours tending to the wounded soldiers who filled the hospital. She saw the pain and fear in their eyes, the haunted look of young men who had seen things they could never forget. She cleaned wounds, changed bandages, held trembling hands through nightmares that wouldn't end. Every time a new group of injured soldiers arrived, Lena couldn't stop herself from scanning their faces, half hoping, half dreading that she might see Ellie among them. She knew it was impossible. Ellie was still somewhere in Europe, fighting her own battles, but she couldn't help the way her heart leapt every time the doors swung open, revealing another stretcher, another pale, bruised face. At night, when the ward finally quieted and the hum of the city outside settled into a soft lull, Lena would sit by the window of her tiny apartment and write letters to Ellie. She filled page after page with stories about her days at the hospital, about the patients she met, the little jokes the other nurses told to lighten the mood. She wrote about the city, about how the fog rolled in thick some mornings, turning the streets into a maze of shadows. She wrote about her dreams, the little house with the garden and the swing, the way she imagined Ellie laughing as they watched the sun dip below the horizon. She sealed each letter with trembling hands, walking them down to the post office and handing them to the clerk, who knew her by name now. "Another one for your friend?" he'd ask with a small smile, and she'd nod, hoping he couldn't see the fear in her eyes. But no letters came back. Days stretched into months and still nothing. Each day without a reply felt like a thread unraveling in her chest, leaving her raw and exposed. She tried not to let the worry seep into her letters, tried to keep them light and hopeful. But sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, she couldn't stop the questions from crowding her mind. Was Ellie safe? Was she hurt somewhere across the sea, too far for Lena's hands to reach? One chilly November morning, Lena found a small envelope waiting in her mailbox. Her heart leapt as she tore it open, fingers fumbling with the paper. But it wasn't from Ellie. It was from the War Department, addressed to friends and family of Private Eleanor Hill. Her knees went weak, and she clutched the side of the mailbox, reading the carefully worded letter that seemed to swirl in front of her eyes. The words blurred together, but she saw enough to know that Ellie was missing in action, somewhere in the fields of France, with no promise of return. Lena pressed the letter against her chest, leaning her forehead against the cold metal of the mailbox. She closed her eyes and whispered Ellie's name into the still morning air, as if somehow across the miles, Ellie might hear her. As if she could reach out through the darkness and bring her back. The days that followed felt like a blur, each one blending into the next. Lena threw herself into her work, trying to focus on the patients in front of her, on the small comforts she could offer. But there was a heaviness inside her now, a dull ache that settled in her bones. The world felt colder, sharper, and every time she caught a glimpse of a soldier's uniform in the street, her heart twisted painfully. One night, after a long shift, Lena returned to her apartment and found herself sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at the locket she still wore around her neck. She opened it with trembling hands, tracing the tiny photo of Ellie she'd kept inside. The image was worn and faded, but she could still make out the familiar curve of Ellie's smile, the warmth in her eyes. She pressed the locket to her lips, her vision blurring with unshed tears. "Come back to me, Ellie," she whispered into the quiet of her room, her voice barely more than a breath. "Please, come back." She fell asleep that night with the locket clutched in her hand, the promise of a dream clinging to her like a lifeline. And in her dreams, Ellie was there, laughing under the sun, her hand warm in Lena's as they walked along the bay. They stood together on the little hill outside of town, watching the sky turn gold, and for a moment it felt real, like they could stay there forever, untouched by the world. But when she woke, the room was cold and empty, and she was alone. And all she could do was wait and hope, and hold on to the dream of that little house by the coast, even as the world around her grew darker.